So we will start by setting our motivation. So we generate these minds of confidence in his teachings and a mind of bodhicitta to understand the purpose of implementing his advice, getting the result of his path of training is to unlock our potential to be of limitless benefit to sentient beings. I try to set the motivation of listening and participating with those minds of confidence, refuge, bodhicitta. All right. So we are continuing in the section on refuge, and we alluded last time to one of the aspects of the training in refuge in identifying the three jewels of refuge, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Arya Sangha, that one of the aspects of training in refuge is to come to understand the extraordinary qualities of each of the three jewels of refuge, convincing ourselves, demonstrating to ourselves why we ought to regard the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Arya Sangha as a valid source of protection, of safe direction, which is a way of translating the word refuge, as a source of infallible guidance and protection. So that's kind of the next section that is coming up, is going into these qualities. And of course, if we also study the middle length Lamrim or the Great Treatise, you'll find more detail, you'll find more scriptural citations for these contemplations, but generally that's what this next section is going to go into, is what are the excellent qualities of the three jewels that demonstrate to us that they can serve, or they ought to serve, as a reliable source of refuge, protection, safe direction. So any thoughts or questions if you missed last week or you saw it online, or any questions from prior material? Okay. So we are on day 139, and the quotation on day 139 from Lama Zopa is, "The Buddha has neither suffering nor fear of suffering." He says to come to rely on the Buddha, we must investigate and see his incredible qualities. There are many ways to do this. The stories about his life, both before and after his enlightenment, are a great source of inspiration. So he tells the story, just one story in this contemplation about how sort of an enemy of the Buddha. Um, someone who was jealous of the Buddha's status and following in the world, unleashed a crazed elephant to destroy the Buddha, and um, kind of literally directed this elephant at where the Buddha was physically located with his immediate disciples. And all of his disciples were panicked and running, seeing this sort of charging elephant. But the Buddha remained in his seat, and um, he, you could say, manifested the appearance of, here it says 5 snow lions, which transformed into a circle of fire, encircling the Buddha to create a barrier between himself and this elephant. And then he subdued the elephant through his sort of energetically, I guess, through his great love and great compassion, was able to subdue. Just like I think Geshe Zopa was saying, that the meditators, even just the great meditators, when they go off to the caves and they spend, that people observe that birds and squirrels and whatever sort of woodland area creatures live in India and Nepal, that they tend to be attracted to those great, and they will kind of be pacified and subdued in their presence. And these are just, highly realized, relatively. I mean, some of them certainly are enlightened, but some of them are just highly realized masters. But even then, just their energy, their presence, has that sort of capacity to subdue. And then he says, that there's many stories of all of that, that demonstrate that the Buddha is beyond any fear, any and experiences no suffering. And so the fact that the Dharma, comes from the teachings of someone who has all of those incredibly unusual qualities, is an indication that what he's, since all he's trying to do is explain to us how to follow in his footsteps, how to replicate his own insights, we can look to his behavior and the inner qualities that he's developed, and realize, just, in a way, in a sort of mundane example, when we look at Einstein, or we look at, we can say, oh, that's not an ordinary, intellect, that person is. And so that kind of gives us, of course, we need to, test and validate and examine, but there's credibility, there, that's kind of built into the fact that what's being demonstrated is so different than what's typical. So he says, by destroying both his gross, Lama Zopa says, by destroying both his gross and subtle delusions, he freed himself from the 2 great fears, and therefore is a completely trustworthy guide. We can take refuge in the Buddha without the slightest fear that he lacks the power to lead us out of all suffering and its causes. So, like a physicist, they might take, conventionally, in a mundane way, they might take refuge in Einstein's way of seeing things and think, well, I'm in pretty good company because of what's been demonstrated. And that's kind of the general idea here, is that we can look at the life of the Buddha and the Jataka tales and also which described the training that he engaged in previous lives in order to give rise to the qualities of full enlightenment, and recognize that all of that is incredibly special and unusual, and can give us confidence that what flows, the teachings that flow from such a being, is um, not something that you find um, in really any other person. So day 140, Lama Zopa goes on to say that the Buddha is able to guide us in exactly the way that will benefit us the most. He says the second reason that Guru Shakyamuni Buddha is a trustworthy refuge is because he is extremely wise in guiding all sentient beings from suffering, no matter what the mental capacity or disposition of those beings is. If the Buddha were not completely skillful in guiding all beings, it would be impossible for him to lead them to enlightenment. So here, we can, in a way, we can look at the Lamrim itself, and the way that the Lamrim is constructed with the three scopes, and how we can see that it's incredibly skillful in leading. You can look at the qualities of the Lamrim, that it avoids the appearance of contradiction in the Buddha's teachings, that it allows us to abandon criticizing or denigrating any of the teachings, because we recognize that each of the teachings serve the purpose of leading specific sentient beings who are at that level of development, and that there are other beings who are at a different level, but maybe they've progressed to that level by following the earlier levels, either in this life or in previous lives. And so each of the levels, each of the individual contemplations, they serve the role in transforming ordinary mind into enlightened mind. And how extraordinary it is that anyone could come up with a way of guiding sentient beings in that really, really skillful way. It's not dogmatic. It's not, he didn't say only one thing to every person, regardless of their level of capacity to understand. He, whoever was before him in that moment, he gave them exactly the right teaching, exactly the right instruction to guide them onto, the next stage of their own development. And it just so happens that you can kind of categorize all people into those. He met so many people over the course of that his career teaching, that there are trends, there are similarities, that he was able to meet enough people that we can group kind of all of those teachings, which is what Lama Tsongkhapa and Atisha, these great masters that came later, they were able to identify these sort of patterns of, well, people who are like this, who are at the beginning. These are the instructions that he would give when people were more advanced and they had already realized, some of the more introductory. He was able to give them this level of teaching, and then for the most advanced practitioners, he was able to describe things in this way. And so they sort of recognized the patterns that already existed in the sutras. They didn't invent, they were also in many cases enlightened, and Lama Tsongkhapa and so on, but they were able to just pick up on how the Buddha chose to approach his teaching and what those patterns were in how he related to people of different levels of capacity. And they recognize that all of us fall into, these categories. We all need to progress through the small scope, the middle scope, and the great scope. And so they just condensed and streamlined those teachings, but didn't change them. Nothing in the Lamrim is anything other than the Buddha's teachings. They just packaged them in a really sensible, easily understood way, rather than recognizing that we certainly can't look at the sutras and do that ourselves. So certainly we benefit from that having been done for us, but um, those patterns, those teachings were already there in the sutras. It's just that if you're faced with the sutras and you're an ordinary person, the likelihood that you'll extract that is quite difficult. Um, so, but we can see that it is the Buddha himself who had that ability to lead each sentient being in the way that was most appropriate for them individually to be led, which again is, it's easy to just sort of say one thing to all people, and you don't have to worry about what their level. It's much more difficult to be able to take difficult concepts and explain them in different ways to different levels of disciples. But the fact that he was able to so skillfully do that is a clear indication of his own realizations. Yes, Aaron.
I have a question. So then, is the Lamrim a preparatory for practice, or is it a practice on its own, or does it depending on what our goal is?
So the Lamrim is a way of condensing all of the sutra teaching. So in that sense, it prepares, if so if you look at the foundation of all good qualities, sort of the glance meditation on the Lamrim, Lama Tsongkhapa is presenting it as, when he gets to the section where he says, having become a pure container, please bless me to enter the holy gateway of the fortunate ones, the supreme Vajra vehicle. So Lama Tsongkhapa is explaining, in that sense, that the sutra teachings are meant to ripen our minds for Vajrayana, to create the necessary level of renunciation, insight into emptiness, bodhicitta, the three principal aspects of the path. So in that sense, it serves as a foundation, as a preparation for having the kind of mind, becoming the kind of practitioner who can take advantage of the Vajrayana teachings. Without that basis, without that training, that foundation, just going right to the Vajrayana isn't likely to be super effective. And there are differences of opinion, about that within Tibetan Buddhism. But in the Golug tradition, it's really presented that way, that we should really make strong effort in realizing the Lamrim and start with that. And then after, so generally in the monasteries, the very first thing is that if a person is considered a meditator, and because not everybody, there's different paths, not everybody's going to be a great meditator, but for those who kind of take that as their main path, they'll really make effort in cultivating calm abiding, recognizing how incredibly important it is in generating realizations of the Lamrim. And then they'll, really try to have those realizations, and then at a certain point, of course, and they're being guided, by a teacher, during all of this, and and then at some point, Vajrayana becomes the main practice, supported, by um, continuing to understand the Lamrim and make effort on it, but they change. Yeah. Mhm.
And how does it relate then to like Nundro?
So Nundro is specifically for the law, is for Vajrayana. So that um, so and that there's also differences in different Tibetan traditions as far as which Nundro is particularly emphasized. But you've got refuge practice, you've got water bowl practice, purification practice, mandala offerings. You've got different, and so these are considered merit making activities and also purification activities. They are something that a person would um, do with an understanding that eventually they will be focusing on Vajrayana, that maybe in however many 10 years, 20 years, that will become the main focus. And so they'll try to accumulate 100,000 water bowl offerings, 100,000 refuge, prayers, and 100,000 Vajrasattva, long Vajrasattva mantras in the context of the four opponent powers. So it's not just reciting 100,000 Vajrasattvas, it's 100,000 Vajrasattvas in the context of a practice where you're engaging in the four opponent powers also, um, with the understanding that that helps also to condition the mind to be successful in um, in Vajrayana. And some people will do that. So like Geshe Zopa was saying, this idea of 100,000, it isn't. Geshe Zopa was really emphasizing in his teaching on. I think it was. Yeah, it was just the last one that he did, particularly on Lojong practice, where he was saying that, the great masters, they integrate, what we call the preparatory practices, is something that they spend their whole lives really continuing to emphasize. So the way that I've heard it described is that 100,000 of this, 100,000 of that. Like once you've done the 100,000, now you know how to do it. Um, it's meant that the 100,000 is that like now you're good at it. But that it isn't. So like from our perspective, we kind of have the wrong, or many people, in the West kind of have the wrong attitude, which is kind of what Geshe Zopa was saying. We think, oh, I just need to do 100,000 of this and this and this, and then I'll be done. Because you can do 100,000 Vajrasattva in like a 3-month long retreat. People do that. And that means like 8 to 10 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 months. So it's a strict, serious, long-term thing. Maybe 6 hours. I mean, but maybe 6 to 8 hours. Um, but so in theory, you could think, oh well, yeah, I'll go do a 3-month retreat, and then I'm finished. I've done that. That's over with. And that's the wrong way to think about it. That's kind of the minimum that we need to learn the practice and to become proficient at the practice. But yeah, but you also find different within like Sakya and Nyingma. They emphasize different preliminary practices. But so basic, and some people, like I know that my teacher when he had done certainly 100,000 of all of the practices probably, but then he was going to do a 3-year retreat, so he did them all again. He did 100,000 of all of the practices again, just for a 3-year retreat, just to prepare his mind for just one 3-year retreat, which was something that he did as a teaching to his students, really, that it's something that you do, that to just take it seriously, and really, that it's incredibly powerful. And Lama Tsongkhapa did millions of these, of mandalas and things over the course of his life. So it's not something that we should ever discard, is what Geshe Zopa was saying. And that if we're going to do Vajrayana, if we're going to do like a 3-year Vajrayana retreat, or if we're just going to take Vajrayana as our main practice at some point, prior to that, we do want to have completed 100,000 of all of the practices, or at least the ones that our teacher has, told us to focus on, or, exactly, it depends on exactly how you want to do that. But ideally, most of the typical Nundro practices. But then, that doesn't mean that we should feel like that's it and that we're done now. But you don't find, that all of that, I assume, because there's not like a chapter because as I said before, Sutra and Tantra historically have been very separated bodies of knowledge. So you're not going to find a chapter in the Lamrim on Nundro practice. You kind of just have to get it from a teacher, or it's something that you find that comes from the Vajrayana tradition itself. So, in terms of thinking of it, of course, purification, that's something that the Buddha taught. And you can think of purification separately from Nundro. You can think of all of these things separately from Nundro. Water, because you do water bowls every day, you do purification every day, you do refuge but the idea of doing them, as a Nundro practice is specific to Vajrayana. Otherwise, it's just something that you might do from time to time, but to think of accumulating 100,000 of each of them is unique to the Vajrayana tradition. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? Yep.
I'm sorry to ask again, but my question was, how does the Lamrim look if we just stick to Mahayana? Can we just stay there then, so to speak?
You mean just sutra practice, like to just stay with? Yeah, it's a very personal thing. Lama Zopa, Geshe Zopa was saying, the idea is clear in Tibetan Buddhism that a person has to, at some point, practice Vajrayana, or enlightenment isn't possible. That you can have a direct, non-conceptual realization of emptiness on the sutra path, but you won't actually become fully enlightened by doing that. So in that sense, if you join that with bodhicitta, then you become a bodhisattva, because that's all still sutra path, and so there's nothing wrong with that. You can still, you can progress through the bodhisattva grounds and paths and all of that, but there comes a point where you have to practice Vajrayana in order to achieve full enlightenment. There is no sutra path method for achieving full enlightenment. There's no such thing. And so, the thinking is, well, why not? Why not just go ahead and think about that? And of course, a person has to be prepared for the tantric vows and commitments, and so, but so there's no reason to. Certainly, we don't want to rush into any of these things. We don't even want to rush into refuge, but there, at a certain point, a person will have to practice Vajrayana, but it's very personal. It doesn't have to be in this life. So, like I said, Lama Tsongkhapa thinks of the Vajrayana, the sutra teachings, as becoming a pure vessel. So certainly, we can kind of wait and be like, "Am I a pure vessel or not?" And then decide. Yeah.
And what would qualify as the right amount of Vajrayana to achieve full enlightenment? Like, could we do it just like with white Tara or something else?
So, there's different levels of tantric practice. There's action tantra, yoga tantra, highest yoga tantra, and in order to achieve full enlightenment, it does have to be a highest yoga tantra practice. The action tantras, yoga tantra isn't really that popular in the West. It's usually you kind of either find action tantra or highest yoga tantra. There aren't too many yoga tantra initiations that you tend to find. So an action tantra cannot create the causes and conditions for enlightenment. It can help. It can help to bring you closer to certain energies. It can help to create, shift karma around in beneficial ways, but it won't lead a person to enlightenment. It has to be a highest yoga tantra practice, of which there are many different meditational deities, and any of the meditational deities are sufficient. Any of the highest yoga tantra practices all equally are effective and powerful in doing that. Broadly speaking, there's an idea that people have different predispositions or different karmic connections with different practices. And because you find there's mother tantras and father tantras and non-dual tantras, so these emphasize different ways of working with the subtle energy system of the body, and even to some degree they will present different systems of visualizing the chakras. And so there's a general idea that if you can, it's good to kind of try to identify which of the various practices individually a person is most suited for, which generally is my understanding you really can't puzzle out by yourself. That's kind of a challenge, I think. So generally what people will do is they'll try to ask their root guru, the person that they've come to trust, and has the highest level of, kind of, can you tell me who my yidam is, which meditational deity I personally have a karmic connection to. And also, like I said, it can be that your particular energy system is most effectively influenced by one specific presentation of the chakras and so on. So in that sense, there's a general understanding that if we pick the right practice for ourselves, it's better or best compared to a different practice. Um, but that's a little tricky. You've got to kind of ask the right person, and they have to sort. And maybe they would say, "I don't know," or "I can't tell you," or they might give you some other kind of way of responding to your question, or they might say, "Well, this other, maybe ask this person," or you know. Um, so how they answer that question is, they're not necessarily going to give you a straightforward answer. But if you find that sort of ideal to practice that way, um, but I mean, any of the practices are, you know, they all have any of the highest yoga tantra practices. They all have that capacity to lead a person. So in that way, you can kind of think, because there's peaceful practices, there are wrathful practices, so you can kind of get a sense of like how you feel when you imagine that deity. Um, do you want, how does a wrathful practice kind of feel to you? How does a peaceful practice kind of feel to you? um, you can kind of get a sense of it. Because they're working with, like I said, also, because they're trying to transform different kinds of energy. So the wrathful practices are more so transform, purifying anger and so on, and the um, peaceful practices are transforming compassion and love. And so because people are different, and they'll respond differently to these different kinds of practices. Um, so the best thing is to try to get advice from the most qualified kind of person that you can. Hmm.
Sorry to hog it, but what about Mahamudra? Like, would that be able to do it? Because I know there's Sutriyana Mahamudra and then the
Hmm.
Vajrayana. I mean, would they be able
Yeah.
to?
Um, is my understand so I don't know a lot. I haven't, because also Mahamudra is described in there's the Gulug, there's the Kagyu Gulug presentation, and then you've got like a way of thinking about it from Nyingma. So it's a little bit different in different traditions as well. Um, so all I can it's certainly a way of realizing emptiness. Uh, but also all I can say um, is that it's my understanding that a person has to have a highest yoga tantra practice of a meditational deity. Um, Without that framework, it doesn't become possible. A person might add Mahamudra into that, um, or use it as a way, because even just realizing emptiness isn't sufficient. You have to you have to cause the all of the winds to absorb in the central channel. So you have to progress from generation stage to completion stage in tantric practice. Whereas Mahamudra really is a mechanism for realizing emptiness. So a person might use it for that purpose, but I don't personally know of a way of achieving enlightenment without a yidam, a deity yoga practice. Um, I don't personally know of a way. Any other? Okay. So in day 141, Lama Zopa talks about the Buddha's lack of partiality and how that is something that we can take refuge in, that we can find as a source of confidence in his teachings. He feels equal compassion for all sentient beings. He doesn't favor any sentient being above any other sentient being. And he tells the story of Devadatta, the Buddha's cousin, who tried more than once to kill the Buddha, but the Buddha never gave up, trying to benefit Devadatta, never gave up compassion for him. He even saved Devadatta's life after, in this story that Devadatta gave, I guess the story goes that the Buddha's physician gave the Buddha some medicine that was suitable for the Buddha, being the Buddha, to take, but wasn't suitable for an ordinary being to take. And Devadatta was very much an ordinary being, and Devadatta, wanted to prove that he was equal to the Buddha, which is kind of the recurring sort of jealousy that Devadatta had in the Buddha's status and so on. So he took the same medicine, and it nearly killed him. But the Buddha saved his life, even though Devadatta, even though he knew that by saving his life, he was saving the life of someone who, when they got better, probably was going to try to kill him again. So he has no regard for, whether they say that even great bodhisattvas, if one person, if you're on the high level grounds of the bodhisattva path, if there's two people and one of them is like anointing one of your arms with salve, and then the other person is cutting off the other arm, that the great bodhisattva won't think well of the person anointing the arm, and think ill of the person cutting off their other arm, that they'll have equal regard. So that's what the Buddha demonstrated, is his level of training in that. So it isn't that he holds back and only wants to guide some people, or only wants to work for the benefit of some people, that he has devoted, he's equally devoted to leading and guiding every sentient being. So we don't need to think that we need to have certain capacities, or that we need to, only when we've made offerings, or only when we've done this or that we will earn the Buddha's compassion or guidance, that he freely gives that on behalf of all sentient beings. And that's kind of in day 142, kind of a further elaboration of that. Lama Zopa says there's no need from our side to placate the Buddha or ingratiate ourselves or to win favors, even if we've not taken refuge yet, even if we don't ever take refuge in the Buddha. From the Buddha side, he wants to benefit every sentient being equally. He doesn't think, oh, well, these are my people and these are not my people. Every sentient being, the Buddha regards every sentient being as an object of compassion, as an object of love, as possessing the capacity internally to make spiritual progress. So the Buddha will manifest as a non-Buddhist teacher, or in whatever way, to lead sentient beings, irrespective. So if some other tradition or some other philosophical view is the best, then the Buddha will teach that, to that person, because that will create the causes and the conditions for the next life to at least be human again, and at least, have good inner and outer conditions, because they've engaged in virtue, they've avoided non-virtue, and so they've at least created the karmic conditions to have a stable, life where they can continue to think about, they have the freedoms and the opportunities to think about spirituality in general. So, whatever is needed for sentient beings to make progress is what the Buddha will do. He says this is the Lama Zopa says this is the opposite of the way we behave. We generate some compassion, but we feel that it's for those who deserve our compassion. We think that others deserve our anger and our contempt, such as violent criminals or people who exploit others. We also discriminate helpers from harmers. And if anybody has ever harmed us, then we think of them as the enemy, and we have no compassion, and we actually hope that they come to some harm, or we feel like they deserve to come to some harm. So the fact that the Buddha has progressed beyond that way of thinking is evidence that he can be completely trustworthy and reliable in the guidance that he is giving, because he doesn't, he's free from all of that mistaken way of thinking. And so even if, even if we are someone who is engaging in all of these harmful actions, stealing, killing, and so on, even that, the Buddha will want to guide us and create the causes and the conditions. He doesn't think, oh, well, that person's beyond hope, or, I've given up on. The Buddha doesn't give up on any sentient being, regardless of what they're doing with their lives or how they relate to the Buddha or his teachings. He's always trying to work for the benefit of even the worst, most deluded, most obstructed, um, most violent people. So day 143, now Lama Yeshe is saying, taking refuge in the Buddha is the only way we can realize our latent capacity for attaining inner freedom. And he mentions that, he says, many people do not understand that it's only the light of wisdom that can elevate them into liberation, nirvana, or whatever they want to call it. So they take refuge in material things instead. He says they also engage in mistaken practices, and he talks about animal sacrifice, which is common to a number of philosophical and religious traditions that the Buddha argued against. Even in present day Nepal, there are these festivals and so on. Again, Geshe Zopa was talking about, he lives in Nepal, or he doesn't live there now, but he has lived there earlier in his life, and he spends time there every year at Kopan and so on. So he's familiar with these. He says that the streets run just rivers of blood with the animal sacrifices. He says, Lama Yeshe is saying, at certain times they kill as many as 100,000 sentient beings in a day. So So, and Geshe Zopa was saying how awful it is that, I mean, literally the streets, there's rivers of blood with these sacrifices, and how mistaken that way of thinking is, that you need to do that kind of thing. And that when you do that, you're actually moving yourself further away from enlightenment, and not, under the mistaken belief that you're pleasing some sort of deity, and that deity will help you. And in fact, you're only obscuring your own mind more and moving in the wrong direction. He says, Lama Yeshe says, it's so worthwhile to take refuge in that which can truly liberate us. Otherwise, we'll see people taking refuge in the sun, the moon, or something up in the sky. They look up, pleading for God's help, yet down here on earth engage in ridiculous actions, somehow expecting Him to reach down and say, "My child, come to me." God can't guide us in that way. It's impossible. So Geshe Zopa was saying that, maybe that, because the Buddha, in Buddhism, we do have the understanding of the desire realm gods, and there's some view that maybe some of these, and the desire realm gods do have some capacity to interact with beings who make a karmic connection with them. And but he's saying, Geshe Zopa was saying a lot of times that, that they can be kind of that from their side, they kind of want to be worshipped. They kind of want, from the side of the desire realm gods, they kind of feed off of that adoration, and so maybe some of these practices have been over the millennia, have cropped up because of that interaction that can happen, but that the desire realm gods really can't do anything of any real value. That they can, maybe they can interact with the elements to some degree. So this idea that, well, you can get a good harvest, or there might be some historical context, some truth to, that elementally some things changed or shifted when the desire realm gods felt like they were getting propitiated in some way, but that there's no real true benefit that we can receive from the desire realm gods with respect to achieving enlightenment. So there's some view that maybe some of these practices have that kind of origin, that they arose because the lifetimes of the desire realm gods are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps. So for all of, modern human history is only, is less than 10,000 years, really. And so could be that the desire realm gods that existed 10,000 years ago still exist, even now, the same exact energies or beings. So it's just something to think about in that sense. All right, might be enough for today. Any thoughts or questions from what we've covered today? Nope. All right. So we'll leave it there. Hope you feel better, Kodo. There's something going around. Geshe Zopa got it, and I had it. Different people, it's been going around. It's consequences to lifting the mask mandate, I guess. We're now subject to these things that maybe we wouldn't be if we all kept our N95s on, but samsara. All right, so we will just dedicate. So we'll recollect our altruistic motivation that we established and think that by having listened and participated, we have actualized that motivation, created positive energy in the mind. And that positive energy, when it ripens, will ripen in beneficial ways. So we try to strongly visualize all of the vast beneficial ways that we offer the fruit of our practice for the benefit of all sentient beings without exception. All right, so we will continue on Monday with understanding the incredible qualities of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the Arya Sangha. All right, have a great weekend. We'll see everybody
You
soon.
too.